Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today I'm live with Dr. James H. Charlesworth and Dr. Lawrence A. Schiffman. How are both of you doing?
Fine, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I couldn't feel better, and I'm thrilled to be with Larry Schiffman again, a man that I learned so much from, especially how to be a good person.
Thank you for all these wonderful compliments. Of course, I could return all of them to Jim. As you can see, we're very good friends for many years and always like to do programs together.
So I want to ask both of you, what do both of you think about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how it has changed everything in scholarship?
Look, I think it's not just scholarship, but let's start a little bit with scholarship.
Right.
Well, I come to the conclusion a long time ago that there's something funny about this. Coming when it did, the discovery of the scrolls came at a time somewhat after many other discoveries that should have put us on the right direction to understand the variegated nature of Judaism in that period, the way it served as the background of Christianity, all the stuff that we're going to talk about. We should have understood it, but somehow we really didn't totally understand it. And then the scrolls came out when they did and pointed in those directions in a very serious way. And then the other side of the answer to this question is that the scrolls came at a time right after the Holocaust and right before the founding of the State of Israel, when there was going to be a lot of discussion, tremendous amount of discussion about whether or not the way in which Christianity had understood Judaism in the past needed to be reevaluated. And the scrolls were a tremendous positive stimulus for that and helped to bring about some of those changes that have happened in Jewish-Christian relations throughout the years since their discovery. So they also played a role in our modern world. Of course, this is not to mention the nonsense stuff, which has caused some entertainment that's come from the scrolls. But those two very important things have shaped us in many ways, and that's thanks to the discovery of the scrolls.
James Charlesworth?
I couldn't agree more with Larry. My own life changed tremendously. When I was a young boy, we used to stress that Jesus was unique. And I began to realize that he was very Jewish. And people said, no, you don't have that idea. The eschatology, the belief in the Holy Spirit, all of that stuff only comes later from the Greeks. And lo and behold, we find it among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are helping us understand Judaism, helping us understand a very complex culture. Judaism of Jesus' time is not the same as Judaism 200 years later. You have the Roman conquest and the burning of the temple in 70, but before that you have so many different groups. I've counted about 25, and among those are those that follow John the Baptist and those that follow Jesus and those who were complicated followers of different people like Hillel, Shammai, and other rabbis that we know about. What is the bottom line? Christianity clearly began deep within the hearts of Judaism.
So which sect wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? What are the opinions that you both have on that?
I have a comment about this before we even start to discuss it. First of all, the word wrote is a problematical word. Do you mean copied or composed? Second of all, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain material counting almost every book of the Hebrew Bible, for example. So if you mean composed, this is a very wide question. And not only that, there are documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls that clearly weren't written by the people who gathered the composed, that is, the people who gathered the collection. So before we even start to talk about it, we have to know what you meant by who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, I've heard that you, from what I read of your work, you put the Sadducees as a key player at the Qumran.
My point is that the people who composed the documents that are the Dead Sea Scrolls are a manifold group of groups. Now, there's no question that the majority view, which we can debate a little bit, is that the people who gathered them were the Essenes. That's the majority view. I've raised the point that the Sadducean group seems to have, in some way or another, been formative for the halachic traditions of the sect, and maybe even for the historical coming into being of the sect, right? Then we have the different points of view about whether they are the Essenes or not, but that refers in composition only to a core group of texts that are from the actual sect that lived there and gathered it, which are the people who are one of the sects of the Second Temple period. But there's stuff by all kinds of other people, composed by all kinds of people there.
I want to agree with everything that Larry has said, and then make my particular conclusion. Built upon everything he said, I studied Josephus, and I made a list of about 128 points that Josephus made about the Essenes, what they believed and how they were different from the Sadducees. And almost every one of them, 100 at least, can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not all composed by Essenes, but the major documents certainly are, I would call the major documents, the rule of the community, the war scroll, and some of the Pesherim, I would say. These seem to be qualitatively Essene compositions.
Well, we should also emphasize that these documents have a certain Hebrew style and a certain terminology and a certain invective hatred against a lot of other people. So that's what, when Jim says, these core documents or whatever, that's what we're talking about. So this gets to a really important point. I think we two agree, and almost everybody in the field agrees, that whoever gathered the library had composed these documents we're talking about now and saw them as authoritative, and then gathered other documents that they thought were authoritative or were important or whatever you want to say, like Hebrew scriptures, and then other later documents, many of which they did not compose, and they in fact don't even have this style of Hebrew and invective and the whole thing. So, but it's a complex question, can't just be answered with the one word, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Oh, so-and-so.
Well, I want to bring to the attention something I think Larry might agree with. When you look at the earliest documents among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they date from a period when there were no sects, except, if you want to agree, the Samaritans. I've been writing a lot about Samaritans recently. Their origins go back long before the sects, and we cannot clarify how the Samaritans originated. But most of us think the sects began to appear sometime around 150 BC, give or take what you need, somewhere around there. And I like Larry's idea. Since the Sadducees didn't write much or anything at all, we don't have a way of saying how they agree or disagree with the Essenes. But both of them were very, very strong in the beginning, in the 2nd century BCE. They were very strong in the priesthood. That is clear.
Yeah, I want to make a plug for something about the Samaritans now. Excuse me for taking advantage of free advertising. So our friend and colleague, Stephen Fine from Yeshiva University, put together an exhibit on the Samaritans that just opened at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And anybody who's interested in Samaritans should really get down there to see it. I was at the opening. It's a beautiful, beautiful exhibit, an opportunity to learn about them. And of course, they connect to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because in the scrolls, we have what we call the Proto-Samaritan type of Bible text, which seems to point towards some of the later similarities to the Bible text that the Samaritans passed down, that Bible scholars use as one of the types of texts that they studied to understand the detailed internal development of Hebrew Bible. So Samaritans are a good group to mention. I also, something funny about what Jim said. Many years ago, one of my first articles was about Jewish sectarianism in general. And I started with the Samaritans and dated them to the earlier dating, as opposed to those people who think they came into being later. I mean, there are some people who date them as late as the groups we're talking about. But of course, as Jim mentioned, from 150 or so is when Josephus mentions these groups as existing.
Let me make 2 quick comments. I think they're important. Stephen Fine was my student when I was a professor in the Hebrew University, and we stayed very close. What a wonderful person. And secondly, I have published a a Qumran document. Larry, if I didn't send you one, I will. And it's a copy of Deuteronomy that has a variant identical what we find. You know it, okay. So you do have what we call variants, which support the text of the Samaritan Bible. So when we're asking what was in we call it in English the Old Testament, I refer to it as Hebrew scriptures, although it is Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures. All our terminology is just very confusing for a specialist. We do have evidence that we should not ignore the Samaritan Pentateuch.
We have a question from Neophyte1. Thank you for your super chat. Would the community behind the scrolls be considered monotheists? I noticed mention of Elim gods and statements suggesting humans can be divinized.
Well, I'll quote Sacra Scriptura, the rule of the community, column 3. Me'el hadeoth kol hawei v'nichya. From one God comes all that is and ever shall be. These are extreme monotheists. Under that one God, which I think we can take back to Moses, but people are willing to debate it. Anyway, it's a hallmark of Christianity and Judaism. And I do want to continue to stress how close Jews and Christians are today, how we must be closer and learn from each other and begin to celebrate rather than destroy differences. But these are some of my thoughts that I did want to share.
I want to throw in something about the details of the question, which is the word Elim, when it appears, is referring to angels. And in fact, this seems to be the way it is used in quite a number of Hebrew Bible passages. And second of all, there is one passage which doesn't really refer to a human being divinized, but rather to a human being angelized. And this human is lifted up to some type of situation, which in a certain sense recalls the idea of Melchizedek, as he's understood to have been a kind of right-hand man of God in Psalms. So I think, it's not really divinization. And I think we have to understand sometimes that these types of texts speak with a kind of terminology that isn't indeed ambiguous, so that the person asking the question knew what he was talking about.
I wanted to talk about the dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls for a moment. And there are some people out there that doubt that the scrolls date that early, and they'll ask questions like, how do we know that they date to the sectarian documents in particular, date to the 2nd century BCE or the 1st century BCE?
Well, I don't know which one. Should I start? I mean, let's start with carbon dating. Numerous texts have been carbon-14 dated. Now, carbon-14 dating at the beginning was not all that accurate. It was plus or minus 200 years and stuff like that. Today, it's plus or minus like 25, 30 years. And so a whole lot of them have been dated. That's to start with. Second of all, in parentheses, there are some forged fragments around that were written on old skin. So that wouldn't in itself be sufficient. But then we also have the fact that even though many of the scrolls were removed by Bedouin, they, and rather than archaeologists, the archaeological excavation of the caves, which yielded some additional fragments the Bedouin left, show pottery that we know is the pottery of that period, as well as coins from the period mixed in with scroll fragments. And then we have what we call paleography, which is a study of the history of the script. And this is a field of study which some of our colleagues have really done beautifully. And so by looking at the history of the script, you can figure out when things were composed. And then the final point, Jim actually wrote a whole book about this, is the way in which some of the texts tell us the history of that period and fit into the history of that period and make it very clear that it's talking about things that happened in what we call the Hasmonean period, which is the period after the Maccabean revolt ended in, depends when you want to end it, but let's end it in 152 BCE, running up through the Roman period in the land of Israel and the eventual destruction of the temple in 70. So we can be pretty darn certain that that's when these texts come from.
Certainly, full agreement. I studied under DeVoe. He was a very careful archaeologist. you have abundant evidence, material evidence, and paleography is a science. It is not just an art. And when we get a document that we can date through carbon dating or DNA or other methods, then we can see how that relates to other documents, and then we can get a sequence.
Does anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls remind either of you of anything that we see in the New Testament? Also, another question to that would be the Talmud.
I think we know how to divide this. Would you mind if we went chronologically, Larry?
Okay.
Okay. Let me turn to a passage in the New Testament in the Gospels. And Jesus asks a question. Which of you who had an animal and it fell into the pit on Shabbat would leave it there? Well, my goodness gracious. I'm wondering, why would Jesus ask such a question? Everything we know from the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pseudepigrapha, the Apocrypha, the Old Testament, everything talks about being very careful to observe the Sabbath. Well, that doesn't mean you leave an animal in the pit on the Sabbath. And I was startled to find one of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Damascus Document, column 1, that says if you have an animal and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, Shabbat, you must not help it out. Then it becomes problematic. When is helping out an animal a work? So Jesus, how does he know this law? Did he read a Dead Sea Scroll? Did he have someone that told him about it? Did he listen to an animal cry on the Sabbath and felt that you had to do something? There are many options, and I personally have no doubt this goes back to Jesus. But let me read another passage, and I want to read it.
Let me jump in for 1/2 second on this one, which is if you go to the Talmud, and you see the same discussion, they have what you might call an in-between position. They say you can't totally yank the animal out because you're not supposed to be touching the animal. So what do they tell you to do? They tell you to bring pillows and boards and put them there and then smash the animal a little bit on his back until he manages to climb out. So they, on the one hand, they're agreeing with the early Christian view that you don't leave the animal there, but they're agreeing on the other side. They're like in the middle here, that when you get the animal out, still don't violate the Sabbath to do it. So that's a great example of how all these texts are talking about some of the same issues.
And Larry, a wonderful example how we both need each other. Jews need Christians because there's just too much literature and too much tradition to think we can sail along without help. Thank you very much for that, and I appreciate it. Now, I want to read to you from John just 2 verses. It's John 12, if people want to look it up, beginning with verse 35. Jesus said to them, that is a group of Jews, the light is with you for a little longer. Walk while you have the light. Now, that's very interesting because in the rule of the community, the most important document talks about walking in the light and walking in the darkness. So I get kind of curious. Is this just common knowledge or what? And then it says, lest the darkness overtake you. But he who walks in the darkness, my gosh, one can argue that's plagiarism right from the Dead Sea Scroll that talks about those who walk in the darkness. You don't have that phrase in thousands of Jewish documents. And then it goes on and says, while you have the light, believe in the light that you may become sons of light. The Greek is very clear. Hina huioi photos geneste. Huioi photos means sons of light. Now in Hebrew, that's clearly Beni Or, and that is exactly what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, column 3 and 4, the major document.
Now here's where we recall on the other side, if you guys have to go to the Talmud and also the Jewish prayer book, you find a kind of opposite point of view. So it's true, it sets it thinking about it, because in the morning service, which is still recited by Jews until today, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe. And then it says, who creates light and makes darkness, and he makes peace and creates everything. So the point is, that's an argument. No, we don't accept the light darkness, this dualism, because the dualism in the scrolls is very, very strict. The dualism in the scrolls is, in fact, stricter than anything you're going to find in Christianity in the New Testament, and certainly than in Judaism, because there everybody's divided in the scrolls into the people of good and the people of evil, the people of light and the people of darkness, and you're predestined to be there, which neither Judaism nor normative Christianity accepts. We all have free will to be where we basically hopefully want to be as good people. So here you get a polemic against an idea that these sectarians held, which in a certain sense goes one step even further than what the New Testament tries to do with the image, because of course the New Testament is also saying we should all be people of light.
We have a question from John Matcher. Thank you for the super chat. Being ignorant on this subject, but is baptism a concept that arose from the Essene community and the Dead Sea Scrolls? Was John the Baptist an Essene?
I actually wrote a paper recently. I gave a paper recently against a book written by one of my own former students, Joel Marcus, in arguing that John the Baptist wasn't an Essene. Not because he doesn't have certain things in common with the Essenes, because he does, but because he has, it's just not, doesn't work that way. John the Baptist is an individual leader. There's no evidence that he was connected with the sect, and there's a lot different about his immersion than their ritual immersion. So at least that's the view that I took on this. But on the other hand, when you say baptism seems to arise from the very complex development from Jewish purity and impurity, ritual purity and impurity, which was very important to the Essenes and or Dead Sea sectarians. But on the other hand, what the Dead Sea sectarians do, and which Christianity does, is to use it as an initiation rite. And by the way, John the Baptist's baptism isn't exactly an initiation rite, it's a repentance rite. But at any rate, right, this is a very complex, very good question.
When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, many people jumped on the bandwagon saying, John, I call him the baptizer because he's known for what he does. John the Baptizer was an Essene. They argued that he left his father, who was a priest, and lived in the wilderness until he became of age. Well, you can't live in the wilderness and be a little boy. So he probably went to the Qumran Monastery. And people build this up and get very excited. I concluded the locality is very similar, but that's not too helpful. He may have been there, but he was not an Essene. Right. He may have known about the Essenes. They're also in Jericho. But he definitely had a different idea about the Messiah, about eschatology, and about other people. He called all people. Let me make this point. He called all people. And even the New Testament says all Jerusalem went out to be baptized by him. That's clearly a hyperbola. He's trying to say that most of the people in Jerusalem, well, if that's the case, he cannot be an Essene, because the Essenes said most people are going to go to hell.
Right. I want to add one other point, which is that the way we both answered this question says something about a major change in scholarship, because when the scrolls were first found, what people did, especially in terms of Christianity, was to latch on to some parallels which are valid, and then to make the assumption that we know the whole scene. And since we know the whole scene, if X matches Y, then X must be really the origin of Y. Now, we now know, and that's, I think you should be able to detect this in the way both of us talk, that the scene is much more complex. Jim mentioned 25 groups or something, much more complex. And just because we know about parallel X between group A and group B, sorry for changing the letters, parallel X between group A and group B does not mean that group A is group B, because there's so what we call isoglosses stretch between all of the different groups of Jews at that time and all of the different literary texts. And so it's a very complex world. But they thought at the beginning it was a simple world. And all I got to do is pick a group. And if I think this group, and then the Essenes were latched on as a kind of proto-Christianity. And of course, we now don't even know for sure if John the Baptist the way the New Testament associates John with Jesus, which one of actually the various ways should be accepted or not historically. So we see things in a much more complex way than some of your older Dead Sea Scrolls books portray them.
I want to add, well, first of all, thank you, Larry. Perfectly said and perceived. I have argued with some of the best Qumran scholars. They say we have 80% of the scrolls that were put in the caves. I think we have 3%. Let me tell you why. Cave 1 had 77 scrolls at least. We got 7. That's not a lot percentage-wise. We don't know how many scrolls were there. And I talked to the Bedouin in the early years. I used to go to the caves and walk around, and almost every Bedouin said, Ana Abu. He was the one that found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, when they were found, for a good period of time, Bedouin fixed their sandals with them, threw them on the floor looking for gold. And then you have cave 4A and 4B and cave 5. And all along that territory, you have caves. We don't have one scroll. We have about 100,000 fragments. And listen, they were put together wrong because my friends here have studied the hair follicles on the back, and hair doesn't grow in two different directions. So this is not a fragment. It's two fragments. So you see, this is a very complex period. So I do want to stress that those who think we have all the Dead Sea Scrolls or most of them are misled. I am very suspicious what could have been in the other caves. How many caves were there?
Even in the caves we have, when we have fragments of a text, we have 5 to 10% of that fragmentary text, and sometimes maybe even less. Because if we have, like, for example, I edited together with Eric Larson, we edited a fragment that it mentions the king Zedekiah. Now, the point is that we postulated that in a certain sense that we don't know if the text was only about Zedekiah or about all the kings. If it was about all the kings, we would have like 2% of the text, or maybe 1% of the text. And the whole rest of the text would have been deteriorated somehow and lost to us. So even with the ones we do have, we have a small percentage of each one of those manuscripts.
Neophyte 1, thank you for your super chat. Do we know how the DSS material was disseminated in the ancient world? Is it possible for a 2nd century gospel author to have had access to the DSS?
Well, there are people that have made all kinds of claims. It really gets too complex to answer it with any clarity. You'd have to spend an hour discussing when Qumran was burned in the late 60s by Vespasian, Titus, and the Roman troops. Where did the Essenes go? Some of them clearly fled to Masada, no question. And I think many of those scrolls are Essenes. Some of our revered colleagues, Larry, say all of them are. Well, I'm not happy with that. We know that many were taken to Qumran and went up in the flames when Jerusalem was burned. But also, if you read Gnosis on the Silk Road, the movement of Christianity and Jews to the east makes it clear that there are some, quote, Essene terms. And I have to say that I'm of the opinion that almost all the Essenes disappeared about around 66 to 70. I like to stay with that, but I would be thrilled if we come up with a scroll that was on the western, eastern side of the Dead Sea.
What we should add here, and I think Jim agrees with us, that because of the way we look at the whole way in which ideas were being disseminated in the Second Temple period, and then in the early years afterwards, so we have a situation in which many ideas had been disseminated beyond the literary texts in which we may find them. And this phenomenon operates in a lot of ways. So let me point out here that, for example, the Church Fathers mention various apocryphal books. That is, either books relating to the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament, some of which have been rediscovered, but some of which have never been discovered. And so they had apparently a variety of texts that themselves reached back into earlier times, but nonetheless, many of these ideas that they quote, and this you find in the Church Fathers and in the Talmud, beginning mostly in the primarily from 250 on or so, where ideas that we know from Second Temple texts are somehow reappearing. And they suddenly appear in later texts that we don't believe had any access to any of these books. So it seems that there's a whole world of idea dissemination which can't really be traced in any way, and yet was somehow or another happening. And that's, I think, how we would probably say New Testament authors, forget going into the second century, even in the first century, got the New Testament authors would reflect ideas that here or there are known to us from the scrolls. You wouldn't assume that they had access to the text. They don't need access to the text. They just need ideas floating around.
I think that's a very important caveat to some claims. Yeah. When you, Larry, I must say that during our life, we had an early period when most of the people that we knew and associated with were very careful and very gifted. Now I see people, I got tricked into being on radio with a man that I was told was a good scholar. He didn't know Hebrew, he didn't know Greek, but he knew answers to all the questions. And I felt I couldn't tell him he was an idiot, but he was. And you see, you have these problems. What an honor to be with you.
I got to tell you, it's a funny story because I try to check out all these things. I listened to Jacob on a couple of his programs before I said yes. You never know who you're talking to.
That's very true. Let's get to the next question. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat.
Oh.
Astrology and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Doesn't this show the sun is the sun and it gave life to the zodiac stars, i.e. the 12 apostles? The cosmos reflects Earth like a fractal?
I guess I'm the world authority on early Jewish astrology. I wrote many long articles, and my answer to it is no.
It's a good answer.
Okay, we'll get to the next one real quick then. Paul Kickling again, thank you for your super chat. I forgot the scholars named that proved the Essenes had contact with Druids in England. Joseph Arimathea had a mining company in England. I think that before I even answer it, I think that has something to do with the Arthurian legend, claiming that he went to Britain or something like that.
Yeah, well, this is all talking. Now you're into the Da Vinci Code already.
Frankly, scholars refuse to respond to such claims because they are dependent upon a very careful methodology, a mastery of at least 12 languages, and years of studying with professors and doing research. So I would have to say I must pass on those kind of questions. We're moving into myths rather than into facts.
Yeah, I think it should be pointed out maybe that what happens is that people can make up anything they want about this material and sell books. And that's not the business that we're in, as Jim said in a very nice way.
Could any of the material in the Dead Sea Scrolls provide additional information about certain stories in the Hebrew Bible that are based on material perhaps independent of it, like expanding certain stories?
I'll let Larry go first, and then I'll talk about the pseudepigrapha, which...
Right. This gets into the question of what do you mean by providing information? If you mean providing accurate information as if there was something missing that we now have, then maybe one very small example, but in general terms, the material in the scrolls that is supplementary to the Bible was created way after the Bible by people trying to answer questions that we have when we read the Bible. And therefore, they represent interpretations rather than some type of original data somehow that we are missing. Now, that is not the case regarding some textual traditions in the variant manuscripts of the Bible, where it may be that you may have a reading in one of those manuscripts, which is actually a more accurate version of what the original, if you want to call it that, had actually, or the early texts in the time of the First Temple period would have said. That's a different matter. That has to do with the text itself. But when you start to get to these texts that are, let's say, filling in stories of Abraham with new information, that is a type of genre of literature which represents interpretation that was very common. We actually call that Rewritten Bible. That was very common in Second Temple times. Now, Jim's going to talk about a whole bunch of texts, whole books that grew up to do this, which you may as well do it.
I agree with Larry one more time, but not the last time. In the collection of books, each book is about 2 or 3 inches thick. I have edited the documents that did not make it in the Bible. And in these, you have expanded stories of Job, Abraham, David, almost everybody that is important in your mind about biblical. That really is informative, not about David, but about how Jews at that time, when the document was written, imagined they were like. And of course, some of these traditions go back a long way, and we must be open. It's a living Bible. It's not a closed Bible. And we're talking about scrolls, many, many scrolls, not a printed Bible. That's 16th century Common Era.
Now, we should also mention that some of these texts that Jim is talking about now influenced the development of Christianity or Judaism in the classical texts, New Testament church fathers, Mishnah and Talmud, and on into later periods. So these texts have a lot of really important material, right? But they're not telling us, what Jeremiah really did.
What about the apocryphal literature? Some people try to connect the apocryphal literature to the Dead Sea Scrolls, like take, for example, the Apocrypha of Jeremiah and the pseudo epistle of Jeremiah that's attached to First Baruch. What do you guys think about that?
So these are also Second Temple period texts. Mm-hmm. Some authored in Greek, some authored originally in Hebrew, and remnants of some of them were some of the Hebrew ones especially were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I would try this. Jim mentioned his 2 volumes. I'm going to be a wise guy here and mention that I have 3 volumes called Outside the Bible, which has some of his own texts in his own translations, which he was wonderful to let us use. And we put together a collection of Second Temple literature that includes not just pseudepigrapha, right, but also Apocrypha and other Dead Sea Scrolls texts, etc. Why do I mention this? I mention it because we don't see these corpora as separate the way you might think. So, and Jim probably agrees with this, even though I say he published the corpus because we had no corpus, and he brought together the pseudepigrapha for us. But the point is this: there is a literature of Second Temple Judaism. And when we talk about Apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, and Dead Sea Scrolls, that's where we got it. The Apocrypha come from, they were preserved in the Greek Bibles, translated into Latin. The pseudepigrapha were preserved in many other languages and in many different churches, Eastern churches, et cetera, et cetera. And the Dead Sea Scrolls came out of a hole in the ground. But that's not what's important to us. What's important to us is, how does this give us an overall structural understanding of the texts of the Second Temple period and the Judaism of the Second Temple period, and how it influenced later Judaism and Christianity. So therefore, we're not looking at these books in these separate corpora. We're looking at these books when we want to know, either sometimes by genre, sometimes by language, all kinds of things. So that's why it's kind of funny. Some Apocrypha are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're Dead Sea Scrolls and they're Apocrypha. Some pseudepigrapha are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you see what I'm saying? We look at it as a whole totality. But certainly some of the apocryphal books are very, very important for understanding the developments of Judaism in this period. No question at all.
That is why I create everything he said, I think comes out of my mouth also, but maybe not as well.
Maybe I stole it from you.
I created the term Sacra Scriptura, and that is an envelope not to push the rain away, that covers all the literature that Jews and Christians thought were sacred before, let's say, 400 Common Era. Sacra Scriptura. Now you have a lot of writings that are considered God's word that we don't have in the Bible, including the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Greek New Testament. We still have a problem with nomenclature. When I talk about the New Testament, well, it's old. When I talk about the Old Testament, well, it's new. These are terms that do not describe the contents, but terms that we inherited earlier on. I like Sacra Scriptura, were documents composed and then a community thought they contained God's message to us. And I think that's kind of important because that's what the Essenes were doing. They were collecting documents that they literally believed were written by the Holy Spirit and came directly from God.
Let's take a look at the next question. Paul Kickling again, thank you for your super chat. You can look up the scholar Gordon Strachan, who provides pretty robust evidence using physical records showing obvious contact between intellectuals in those times. Legends can start as truth. Do either you want to respond to that or skip?
I'm not sure I understand it, but let me just say one thing. Right? There isn't any question that various intellectuals influenced other intellectuals. The question that is very important to us is it direct or not? Because for us, many of these influences are indirect. And we not only do we think they're indirect, we can even show that when we study the material, because it's not taking over, as you might say, whole cloth. It's echoes and similarities and stuff like that. But there's no question also that some intellectuals met other intellectuals in person. Often this is the big debate where we have this tremendous debate in third century, well, actually second and third century Caesarea, where we have Talmudic rabbis and church fathers, Origen and Eusebius at different times, right? I mean, did these people have contact? But we think they influenced each other. But wait a minute, what really happened? We don't know. So I would just say, I don't know this scholar that he's referring to, but the problem is that when we start, and I doubt there are physical records, by the way, that show contact, because I think that very often people think that little pieces of similarity mean direct contact when they don't.
Many statements in our culture, and Larry and I represent the same culture, which would be American. I come from the Christian side. He comes from the Jewish side. We represent basically the same culture. There are tens of thousands of quotations, and no one knows where they come from. And that is true of almost every culture, that eventually they forget, did Socrates say this, or was it Plato? And that's your study of Plato and Socrates. When does Socrates stop thinking and speaking and Plato takes over? That's just an example of what Larry and I are trying to say. Now, we are very excited about our work. We have had the most wonderful life, but we're not interested in being dogmatic and saying you don't belong in my group because you don't agree with me.
How did the Dead Sea Scrolls shine light on lost perspectives in 70 CE Judaism?
That's a very good. Well,
I meant to say pre-70 CE Judaism.
Yeah, let me make sure I understand the question. I think what you mean is that where do we find in the scrolls approaches that we didn't really know were going on at the time from the sources we had previously? I just give one small example. We talked a little about this dualism thing. I don't think we would have expected this kind of strong dualism, even reading John, had we not had the scrolls. And I think that goes for also the predestination issue. I think there's no question about that. We wouldn't have thought that. And this is not to mention a lot of, let's say, more minor things that you find in the scrolls. But now I want to give an example on another side of something that we would have thought we knew but had no proof for. It's probable that at the end of the rule of community from the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a direct mention of reciting the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, morning and night." This is probably, assuming that it is, that's what it means. It is the earliest mention of that ritual that exists. And so here, what you have here is, and there are many other examples of this kind of phenomenon, of things that we would have known from Judaism or Christianity and thought went back in time, but we wouldn't be able to prove they went back in time until we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's just some thoughts on that wider question.
I have an article on about astronomy and astrology in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I have been able to show that the Essenes, or the people that are behind the scrolls, I would think these are Essene writings that I'm looking at now in memory, they knew that the moon received its light from the sun. So these are very gifted people.
I want to add something to this because I think Jim will agree with this, but he didn't want to give too long an answer. You know, it's very funny. You don't get on these types of podcasts if your answers are too long. They don't want lectures. So let me add a point, which is that if you take a look at the astronomic texts linked with Enoch and linked with the calendar, and you look at them very carefully, you see there is an enormous amount of Babylonian calendric astronomical information that the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we never had an idea that this could be known in the land of Israel at this time. And there's a reference to it in the Mishnah, which is the Jewish book of laws, basically edited around 200. There's a reference there that were rabbis who knew when the new moon was going to come on day 29 or day 30 without having to observe it, because they knew how to predict it exactly astronomically. We never would have believed that was true until we find the Dead Sea Scrolls loaded with the text that Jim was talking about, with all this technical information based on Babylonian astronomy.
I want to raise a question. Is there any possibility of revelation in the cosmic dimensions attributed to Abraham in the Tanakh? And I want to say that maybe no one will agree with me, but I'm moved by it. I don't know to affirm it, but when Abraham was told his descendants would be as many as the sands of the sea and the stars in the sky, well, my gosh, that seems so stupid. How many sands are there in the sea? You know, gracious, how could anybody be so stupid? Lo and behold, with the new telescope, the James Webb telescope, we are seeing galaxies upon galaxies, and in an empty space, more than 7 galaxies appearing out of ex nihilo. So I cannot say that's foolish. I'm wondering, not asserting, is there revelation in this passage?
What do you both think about the fragments found at Masada in the late 1st century? Some suggest that the Jewish zealots during the Jewish-Roman War were largely following the teachings at Qumran, and that the fragments at Masada is evidence of that. What are the thoughts that both of you have on this?
I think there are really two views about this. One view is that basically these texts were common to Jews in the Second Temple period, and therefore some texts that were found at Qumran were also found at Masada. The second view, and you can hold both at the same time, by the way, the second view is that people ran away from Qumran when it was destroyed, because it looks like some of them did go to Masada, and they may have brought texts with them. So these are the two views, but I want to emphasize one other point that people forget in this discussion. The most important texts that were found at Masada are the Hebrew Ben Sira manuscript, which is it's a work that's in the Apocrypha, and that we now, because of also some medieval collections, have recovered much of the Hebrew of. But this is the most ancient Hebrew manuscript of this, like the back part of this text. And then Hebrew Bible, where we see already that the Hebrew Bible fragments of Masada are standardized just like the later texts we call the Masoretic text. So it shows that even when the Dead Sea Scrolls Bibles weren't totally standardized like what we're used to, when we get to Masada, there's a level of standardization, and that it's already been achieved.
James, what's your thoughts on this?
Larry and I have spent our life studying, and we were given gifts by God, and we agree very much. And I would want to stress, I want to say something first, that according to Paul, there are two ways that God gave us: the way through Moses and the way through Jesus. So I want to stress that more and more. I never believe that the Jew is any inferior to me. I want to learn from them because they are God's people. I am in Israel now, and there are a lot of people here that are not God's people, but there are a lot of wonderful Jews, and I want to affirm that. Now, back to your question, which I forgot. What was it again?
My question was the arguments of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, I know what I wanted to say. To add what Larry said, it's quite possible when you read the War Scroll that some of the Essenes took it literally. Now, I often sit in a cave for hours looking down on the ruins, and I imagine massive Roman soldiers coming, 60,000, with weapons of war, with battering rams, with drums, and some of them are moving on to Qumran. How many are there? You want 150? That would be probably the maximum. And these are weak men. They have no muscles, but they go out and they face the Romans. Now, the account, Josephus was on a horse beside Vespasian and Titus, and he saw that the Essenes were not afraid to die. They would cut off an arm, then they would put a sword. I sit there and I kind of cry and think, oh my. But at the last phase of the Essenes at Qumran, I have to be open to the idea that some of them were very much like the Zealots.
We have another question. Paul Kickling again, thank you for your super chat. But would you not agree it's not out of possibility of astrology from many places if you're already adhered to the fact Zoroastrian and Babylonian astrology affected them hundreds of years before?
I'm not totally whether I understand the question, but I'll just say one comment about Zoroastrianism. So one of the views is that Zoroastrianism may be the influence on the Qumran dualism. The problem is that we don't have Zoroastrian texts from this early, but numerous qualified Zoroastrian type scholars, academics I'm talking about, have suggested that this could be the case. I'm not in a position really to make an independent judgment. There was a recent conference on this again, but at any rate, so would you not agree it's not out of possibility of astrology from many places? Well, yeah, astrology, you have to understand, we talk about astrology also, we're talking about astronomy too, technical astronomy. And this stuff spread from Babylonia to the land of Israel. That's what we learn that from the scrolls.
First, full agreement. The two words astrology and astronomy in original Greek often meant the same thing. So when you're talking about astrology or ancient astronomy, you cannot make a distinction. We are absolutely certain that Babylonian astrology and astronomy has been influencing early Jewish astrology. Not directly. It could be directly in Mesopotamia. And remember, beginning in the 6th century, with Cyrus' edict, the people there, I don't know if I can call them Jews, they will become Jews. They come back to the Holy Land and bring many of the new ideas with them. Now, many people today are astronomically sophisticated, but they're probably not interested in astrology.
Let's get to the next one. Anubis Fire, thank you for your super chat. Did the Dead Sea composers believe in the resurrection of the dead? If so, was it physical, flesh, or spiritual? Thoughts on where the idea came from?
Jim, you should start with this, don't you think?
Okay, let me start with this. We were not sure until we found a fragment in Cave 4. I have entitled it On Resurrection. And it begins with, you have to restore Yeshma'u. They shall obey. The heavens and the earth shall obey what? Mashiach. The heavens and the earth shall obey his Messiah. So the first thing is you have a messianic text. The second thing you learn is the Messiah is God's Messiah. At the end of the lines, it talks about, and he shall bring back to life those who have died. So you have two options. Is it God or the Messiah? But I would say some Essenes probably believed in the Messiah and believed in the resurrection. We have to avoid the all fallacy. People are saying all Christians say this, all Jews say that. If you know anything, you know that's wrong. That's the all fallacy.
Okay. Let me just add one point here, which is that it's very important to distinguish between resurrection at the end of days and resurrection of the Messiah, not by the Messiah. Now, resurrection of the Messiah is a distinctly Christian idea, and it is not found in the scrolls. Now, that's the first point. The second point is that it sounds like the resurrection in that one passage and in some later Jewish passages are physical. But on the other hand, throughout the ages, all type of religious thinkers, really starting very early, have argued that it's really not physical, it's really spiritual. But one way or another, it's the resurrection of people at the end of days rather than the resurrection of the Messiah himself. The big debate about the text Jim mentioned, does the Messiah resurrect or does God resurrect? My own view is that it's that God is resurrecting, but it has the Hebrew word for he, without telling us who he is. And that's the discussion. But that is resurrection at the end of days.
I want to add one thing that, as my mind continues to listen and to grow. The only document I have found, and I would like Larry to correct me, I have read thousands of Jewish documents. It's the Hebrew Bible, the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, the mystical text, the Talmud, which includes the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Talmudim, which are two different ones. I have not found any description of the post-resurrection body, except in one document, and it's the history of the Rechabites. And they describe where the sons of Rechab, during the time of Jeremiah, fled, and they went to the island of the blessed. And the person that visits them, obviously it's Sosimus, but I don't think that is original. I think that name was added by Christians. I never said that, but I have to admit that. Anyway, an angelic figure asks them, what is it like? Well, we sit here under the tree and the fruit drops into our hands and we get the water we need, so there's no work. Well, what about the afterlife? All we know is that when the resurrection occurs, I'm not sure it's resurrection, when the new life occurs, everything is identical to the present body except the difference between male and female. That is the only passage I have found where the post-resurrection body is described.
So back Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for your super sticker. No question there. So what do you both think about the teacher of righteousness? Did he, I know that there are scholars that say he lived in the 2nd century BCE and others that say he lived in the 1st century BCE. There's a bit of disagreement about when he lived, from what I can tell. What do you both think about him, this historical figure?
Well, I think he did live in the 2nd century BCE, and that he is one of the main, the leader at the very beginning, but not maybe really the very beginning, but because we have in the Damascus document that we mentioned before, the story that the group was groping around for a while, maybe that's a word we shouldn't use anymore, actually. I think it changed its meaning, but was trying to somehow or another chart a path for themselves until God raised up the teacher. So clearly that their exodus from some kind of temple mainstream or something like this took place, and then they were seeking some kind of leadership, and they found the leader with this teacher. That's the first point. And the second point is people usually asking about this. They're really fishing around for Jesus, and they're fishing around for him in somehow or another being represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which he's not. But the teacher is one of those figures that Jim was talking about before that we know existed in this period, into which we can fit better known figures like Jesus and Hillel and John White, like that, into this kind of large group. So he's a very important person that we don't know his name. There is one theory that it was an office, that they were placed one after another. There's no proof.
Larry has steered us through the rapids quite nicely. I will just try to explain in a dogmatic way so it's clear. I have, from the beginning, believed that there was one righteous teacher, not the teacher of righteousness. He was the right teacher, the proper teacher, the one God chose to be the teacher. He didn't teach righteousness. The second point is that for maybe 20 years, the Essenes were there in the temple. Eventually, they found the righteous teacher. And like almost all the major figures at Qumran, he's anonymous. And I think he waits, and eventually he does go into the wilderness, leading this group that will become Essenes. The period would be sometime after 150. I can't say any more than that. And they move northward along the Dead Sea, and they find a fort left from Iron II that the Israelites had used, and they refurbish it and turn it into their monastery. That has been my position for 50 years. I tend to modify it here and there, but maybe that's what I'm laying it out there, maybe too romantically.
And only one issue that needs to be mentioned here is that the archaeology, they used to tell us that the Qumran site, as a sectarian site, not what existed before, was occupied from about 120 BCE. Now we're being told we're closer to 100 BCE. So apparently the internal development that led from temple, so to speak, or Jerusalem or wherever to Qumran may have taken a little more time than we thought before.
Thoughts on the temple scroll? I've heard that the temple scroll, the dating of it is all over the place. Some people put it in the middle of the 1st century CE. Some people with the 2nd century BCE or 1st century BCE. It's all over the map there. Thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is funny because Jim was involved in an article on this and responding to Yigal Yadin, and I just, together with Andrew Gross of Catholic University of America, published a whole new edition of the Temple Scroll, with editing all the manuscripts. So you picking subjects that we've all been involved in. I think if I remember correctly, Jim also placed it, like Yadin, into the 2nd century BCE. Yeah, and I think we go along with the same dating. But I think the crucial question is whether there are earlier sources, and there's some good evidence that there are earlier sources, which is true about a lot of Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think if I remember his article correctly, as a matter of fact, there's a very funny fact. Somebody sent me an email saying that I was one of the authors of that article, and I think they wanted me to send it to them or something like that. I told them I wasn't one of the authors of the article, but I'm happy to send you a copy. I Xeroxed it. I have the signed copy that Jim gave me in the days before we had online, all this stuff online. We don't really need to share stuff the way we used to have the signed copy. And I think I got it right that you also agreed with that. Am I right?
Let's add that it's the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. While some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are minuscule fragments, maybe even 100 little fragments of one scroll, and you have to figure where do the fragments go. They were on the floor of a cave, and sometimes they were not arranged right. But the Temple Scroll, I think, originally was around 30 or maybe even a little longer than 30 feet. Wow.
Yeah. And not only that, we have 4 fragmentary manuscripts, one of which is very substantial. I mean, the others are a little bit smaller. But that's one of the things that we did, as opposed to the earlier editions. We completely re-edited. Now you have to know that our work started in a copy that we did for Jim's series, right? Because we first did the Temple Scroll in a volume edited by Jim, and we published there what we considered to be a kind of preparatory version. Because when we reworked it, we improved it a tremendous amount. So at any rate, we've all been working on that scroll for a long time.
Thoughts on the Damascus document. It says that the righteous teacher had established the sect about 390 years after the first temple was destroyed, and then plus 20 years in the wilderness. So I guess that's 410 years after it was destroyed. So would you say that would put that around? I think it's
well, he gets 176, 196 to start, 176
BC.
Yeah, would come into existence. But I know my own point of view is not to trust these dates at all. First of all, the Talmudic rabbis had no idea how long it was between the destruction of the temple and the coming of Alexander the Great. And to assume that these people had an exact chronology, that they knew the exact number of years, I wouldn't take any of this literally. So it doesn't bother me. I don't know. I mean, they could have started it before. They could have started in the middle. Could have started afterwards. I don't think we have to follow these numbers in a literal sense. I mean, there are a lot of scholars try to amend. They try to interpret symbolically, take it literally. Every interpretation under the sun. But the problem that you really have is, again, that how could they have really known the exact chronology?
I want to slightly modify my statement because I misspoke. I meant to say 176 BCE, not 196 BCE. 190, not 196 BCE. So if it's not a historical clue that this person established a community in 176, what do you think it means?
Well, I have to point out something very important. According to the Talmudic chronology, which, believe it or not, gets printed in some Orthodox Jewish books today, the temple was not destroyed in 586, it was destroyed in 424 BCE. Now, of course, this is false. It was destroyed in 586 BCE. But the point is that these ideas reflect old ideas that are found in rabbinic tradition elsewhere about the chronology. Now, I have no idea when these people thought, how many years they really thought it was before their own time that the temple was destroyed. So that's what the problem that I'm saying. We can't really know to follow these numbers, right? Although they do come out to these convenient times. You go, oh, we got it. 176, teacher of righteousness. Sounds great. But
well, there are many books written by scholars about the use of numbers. Numbers have a meaning. So when Joshua and the people with him, the future Israelites, walked 7 times around Jericho, no one was said, okay, that's number 1. All right, that's number 2. 7 means the necessary number, the perfect number. So Joshua and the tribes, they walked around the remains of Jericho until they realized there wasn't an army there, and they went up and took the city. We now have archaeological proof that Jericho had been destroyed about 500 years earlier. The same thing goes with the early biblical. Numbers are very important. God created the world in a perfect number, not 7 days. God knows what he did, and we're trying to use numbers, but numbers have meaning.
Why do you think that? Why do people think that many of the scrolls were written? What was the theological point?
why did you ask?
Yeah.
Oh, so I could earn a living.
No. I was saying, why do you think many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written?
That's what I'm saying. They were written so that I could. It was a joke. So that I could earn a living by teaching the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's
Why do you think the Essenes copied or wrote Dead Sea Scrolls? Is that your question?
That's my question.
They literally believed the Holy Spirit was in their midst as did the first people that wrote the Gospels. And we have this in patristics, how the Holy Spirit guided but did not dictate. So you can have imperfection. That is eventually what the Roman Catholics have described about how Scripture contains God's word and yet be imperfect. Nothing that the human touches should be considered perfect. And so you can have scholars that try to keep the path of our culture in the right way. And we need each other to correct us and actually to support us, because it's a lonely life sitting for 30 hours a day. Now, only a scholar can do that, and working on a text.
So I think you have to realize that in the period we're talking about, oral tradition was not valued by most of these groups. Yes, the Pharisees were valuing it apparently. Josephus refers to it as traditions of the fathers. You have the New Testament, right, the traditions of elders, and different things like this. But one way or another, this was a written culture. And there were all kinds of books, remember, in the world around being written at this time. And what you do is you write down your teachings for some kind of posterity and for use inside your group. And the written word is the authoritative word. So I think that that's why a lot of things were written down. And this is not to mention copying other books, because you want to have a copy and be able to read it. And especially with the Holy Scriptures and things like that, you want to have a copy, you got to copy it. It's got to be written.
I want to share a personal experience. I've taken many groups into the Shrine of the Book, the Hekelah Sefer, and one question came to me by people over and over again: have you ever held a Dead Sea Scroll? I said, of course. Many times I was there to guide them and to photograph them, and I was the one that arranged them. I was the one that arranged the copper scroll for digitizing. And the question to me was, did you feel God? And I said, it is an awesome experience to touch a Dead Sea Scroll. Now, I did not answer their question the way they wanted, but it's a spiritual experience. I would think even for people that find it difficult to believe in God, but Larry and I do not. We have experienced the living God.
Last question. What do you both think about the manuscripts, the Hebrew Bible manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because there are scholars that will say, well, in some places there are significant differences from our modern copy of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Thoughts on this?
I don't think there really are significant differences. I think if you put down the differences, right, in English translation, you wouldn't even know they're there, most of them. That's just point number one. Point number two is, as I often jokingly say, you will not find "thou shalt steal" or "thou shalt commit adultery" or anything like that. What you're going to find is that, to quote our colleague Gene Ulrich, who spent most of his life studying biblical scrolls, the good news is that their Bible is our Bible. The bad news is that there are some little differences here or there. And I think the message of the Bible is the same. The Bible that many of us were raised with and which we gain so much guidance from, right? It's essentially the same Bible. Yes, we do learn that its transmission in Second Temple times is much more complex than we would have thought before, and that it doesn't stabilize completely until somewhat after that. But it's still the Bible, still the Bible.
Full agreement.
Well, I thank you both for joining me today.
Thank
I really
you.
enjoyed. Yeah, I really enjoyed.
We got to see each other from across the world.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I thank everybody that super chatted their questions today. I think most of them were good questions, and I thank everybody else for participating in the live chat. And I'll see all of you later. Thanks again.
Well, I think
Dr. Schiffman.
let's put the bottom line here is that Larry and I represent, I think, the same tradition. There is one God. There is one 10 Commandments. There is one Spirit. There is one hope, and there is a definite brotherhood. Let us hope that the hatred among Christians and the hatred among Jews and the hatred of Christians of Jews and Jews of Christians essentially and fundamentally evaporates as we more and more know if one falls, the other one can help him up. We need each other.
Amen.
Thank you both again. I'm gonna end this live stream now. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.